There we go. I was just waiting for that.
The classic. All right. Yeah, this is our, second meeting of the quarter. And I guess I'll let, Neil introduce himself, and we're very grateful to have you here presenting for us today.
All right. I'll reshare in a second. Good evening, everybody, and greetings from upstate New York. To define that, because when you tell almost anybody outside of New York that you're from New York, they think you're from New York City. We're about 75, 80 miles north of New York City here, straight up the Hudson River. In fact, I'm about 4 or 5 miles from the river itself. Right next to a town called New Paltz, New York, which is home of one of the state universities, one of the larger ones, and a very unique mountain range called the Shawangunk Mountains, which is made of a conglomerate rock that is only found here. So geologists come from all over the world to study it. It's a really neat place. And we moved here about 1.5 years ago. I grew up here, and we wanted to come back to this area because I have family here, and we were kind of tired of the congestion and cost of living on Long Island. So we're here, and let me start this presentation. I'm very active in my local club here, which is Overlook Mountain Amateur Radio Club. We're pretty popular because we have a repeater at 2,800 feet above sea level, which is pretty high for the Catskills. We don't have the mountains you do, but let's get up there. And I do some speaking around. One of the subjects I've been speaking on quite a bit lately and running a class for weekly is kit building and just makers stuff in general. So that's something else I frequently talk about. And if anybody's heard of the Long Island CW Club, that's the group that I do the makers class for. If you haven't heard of it, it originated on Long Island, but they have almost 3,000 members now, which is quite impressive. A group tasked with teaching and keeping CW alive. All right, so this is all about Raspberry Pi, not the culinary part of Raspberry Pi, but the computer Raspberry Pi. First of all, who am I? I'm an IT professional. I work in cancer research. I maintain non-standard and odd and custom systems. I basically take care and spec out the computers that nobody else will touch in my organization. So all the weird stuff. Been in IT for 22 years. I was originally licensed as KD2APZ in 2011. But I've been around radio since I was a little kid. I've been an SWL all my life. I was living up here in the Hudson Valley, and I'm back. I had easiest way to find me on the web, and I'll cover that at the end, neilgoldstein.com. There's a blog there called Fofio, and that's where I post usually all the information for these talks. I keep a website, which is really just a post on this blog, but it will resolve from radiokitguide.com. And that's a list of kit suppliers for radio and ham radio. All the different places that you can buy kits and a listing of some of the kits that they offer. And you can get me at this email address, or I'll give another one when we close up. So just an overview of what we're going to talk about. What is the Raspberry Pi and what isn't it? We're going to talk about what SoC means, system on a chip, RISC processors versus CISC processors, history and models of the Pi, layout and features, what can you do with it, and specifically, what can you do with it in ham radio. So the easiest way to say it, Raspberry Pi is a computer. It's a very small, inexpensive computer. It has everything a larger computer would have: input, output, memory, storage, audio, video, just more compact and more simplified. Raspberry Pi is not the same thing as an Arduino or other related microcontrollers. It has a GPIO bus like an Arduino, which are these rows of pins. But even though a Pi can perform many Arduino-like functions, a Pi sometimes gives you the best of both worlds. There's still plenty of reasons to use microcontrollers like the Arduinos. They're better for embedded single-purpose situations where you don't need all of the extra fluff and you're looking to save power. Also, things like the Arduino Uno running on the Atmega 328. I mean, this is a standard that's been around for so long that there's so much code that runs on them. So SoC, system on a chip, this is something that's appeared over the last couple of decades and been refined. And every number of years, they squeeze more components onto a single chip. And this is where, if you looked under the hood of a computer 25, 30 years ago, you saw a lot more components. We've been slowly consolidating a lot of things. Even in a more sophisticated computer, we don't really need to have a lot of the separate plug-in cards and accessories anymore. A lot of things are integrated. A system on a chip, especially with something like a Raspberry Pi or the cell phone that you carry, or a lot of the embedded devices in your home, all of this stuff is embedded on a single chip. And that is a real advantage for making smaller devices and making devices that cool easier and use much less power. Talk about RISC processors. A number of years back, before Apple decided to go with Intel processors, their decision to do that had more to do with the state of manufacturing than it did with them thinking that Intel was a good move. Apple based all of the Macintoshes up to that point on Motorola RISC processors or PowerPC processors. Because the majority of that manufacturing done by Motorola and IBM was for industry and not for personal computers, Apple started losing a lot of manufacturing advantage. And it was a good decision for them business-wise to go with Intel. But back all those years ago, Apple would always try to remind people that if you were comparing speed to speed between their computers and a Windows computer, let's say, you could not look at those numbers and compare them. And if you pardon the terrible pun, you weren't comparing apples to apples, but that's what it was. And RISC processors, which stands for Reduced Instruction Set Computing, are more efficient. They have a much lower set of instructions. They're able to compute more instructions in the same amount of computing cycles, or the same instructions in less computer cycles. They're generally more efficient. The ARM-based processors, which is actually the direction now that Apple is heading in and a number of other companies, are just super efficient. The ARM Cortex A53, which was in the Pi 3, you can't, once again, compare megahertz to megahertz if you want to compare these to something like an Intel processor, but RISC is a more efficient way to go. Why are the rest of our computers still on something like an Intel? Because it makes things compatible. It's really difficult to re-engineer everything, but Apple, I think, just proved to the world that it can be done. So I think we're going to see a lot more things head in that direction again. So the original Raspberry Pi was released in February of 2012, and main goals were accessibility in cost and availability and education. Now, back in the 80s, when the Commodore 64 was popular, the British Broadcasting Corporation, which is a government-funded arm of the British government, subsidized a company called the BBC Micro, a computer. And it was from a company called Acorn, very similar to something like a Commodore 64 or the Atari 400 and 800 of those ages. The BBC Micro was aimed at getting kids to learn how to program. and it reached its goal. I mean, it was insanely popular, and the original Raspberry Pi organizations were looking to do the same thing, to produce a computer. And at the time, the most expensive version of the Raspberry Pi was $35, and it came, and still does to this day, with a pile of programs to teach kids how to write code. Well, I'll tell you, if you're an adult and you don't write code, it works fine for us too. There's a lot of great tutorials and utilities for learning how to program on these things. So this was the original one. I want to touch on this real quick because the BBC, since the Raspberry Pi was released, decided to get back involved in education-oriented computing and produce something called the microbit. Currently in version 2, this is a picture of the version 2. And this is a different kind of board than the Raspberry Pi. It's more like a microcontroller, but it does have some interesting accessories and peripherals installed on it. So it's somewhere between, let's say, a microcontroller and a Pi. They're inexpensive, and they come with all these great learning tools. So just something else to consider and look at. These are around now, and they are very cool. I just got my first one. So this is the original Raspberry Pi 1, and this is a Model A. We really won't touch on the Model A again, but the Model A still exists. It's usually a stripped down version of the regular Raspberry Pi with less ports. Usually doesn't have an Ethernet port. This one only had one regular USB port, and missing a few other features, and sometimes with a slower, more simple processor. Why would you want this? Usually power considerations for embedded use. If you were designing a device that didn't need all those extras, it's going to be a lot more power efficient. This is the original Model B. The first ones that came out only had 256 megs of RAM. I was on a very early waiting list, and I have one of these things. I have a 256 meg Raspberry Pi 1 Model B. When I heard the 512s were coming out, I immediately ordered another one. And Pi was in use for many, many years here. And, you know, I'm going to run into it as I'm going through all these boxes of stuff that I have. But I was using it as a print server. I had a favorite brother laser printer that I didn't have. I never could put it near an Ethernet port, so I turned it into a wireless printer by using the Pi with a Wi-Fi card on it, of course. These early ones didn't have Wi-Fi. The Model B Plus was the first form factor change, and I'll show you. The original one had a full-size HDMI port, which the new one still has, but it had this giant RCA port for composite audio and a separate 3.5 millimeter jack for audio, analog audio. So composite video, analog audio, 2 USB ports, and Ethernet here. This form factor stayed all the way up until the Pi 4. This is 4 USB ports, just USB 2.0, Ethernet, HDMI, and now they've combined composite video and analog audio into one jack. Similar to, if any of you have digital cameras that use those composite 3.5 millimeter jacks to get audio and video out of the same jack. It's a very similar jack to that, and I think it's the same pinouts. And we're upgrading each time here. These numbers are going to go up. This Ethernet port is only a 10 meg port, or 100 meg port. It's a 100 meg port because you're limited in speed by the USB bus, and it was only a USB 2.0 bus. So the Ethernet was always a little slow. With these, if you wanted wireless, you had to add a Wi-Fi card. This is the Raspberry Pi 2 Model B. We're up to a 900 megahertz quad core now, a full gigabyte of RAM, Ethernet, HDMI. All of this has pretty much stayed the same. They also went from a full-size SD card to a micro SD card, but they made that form factor change in the last model. And they added some GPIO pins. This is the Pi 3 Model B. This is the 3 is where they added Wi-Fi and Bluetooth. We're still going up in speed, 1.2 gigahertz quad core. Not much else has changed here. This is the B plus, 1.4 gigahertz quad core, improved Wi-Fi, dual band now, updated Bluetooth. Everything was starting to get a little better. Still limited to the slow Ethernet port and USB 2.0. But we're getting there. And this is where we changed form factor again. The Raspberry Pi 4 rearranged everything. We went from full-size HDMI to 2 micro HDMIs. So we now have dual monitor support. We went to USB-C power, still retaining that crazy composite 3.5 millimeter plug for composite video and analog audio, but now USB 3.0 and full gigabit Ethernet, because now we have the speed to support it off of the USB bus. Keep integrating. If you look at the board differences from the early ones to this one, there's less components on the board. So there's more integration going on as well. 1.5 gigahertz quad core, 64-bit ARM8. Now the operating system that's running on it isn't 64-bit yet, but we have that ability now. 2, 4, or 8 gigs of RAM. Well, for a 32-bit operating system, you can't really do more than 4 gigs of RAM as far as being able to address it. But this was a sign that 64-bit OSs were on the way. During the 3 to 4 shuffle, the Raspberry Pi Zero came out. This is a board the size of a stick of gum, using the micro SD card, 2 micro USB ports, one for power, one for USB. It's only a single USB port for interfacing, but you do have the ability to take that and use what they call an OTG adapter. On the go is what that stands for, to convert it to a full-size USB port or attach a hub so you can have multiple peripherals. Keep in mind that anything that's relying on what we call USB bus power is going to require a powered hub, because this thing is not going to put out enough power to run, let's say, a full-size portable hard drive or something like that. That's the look of this. They come usually with the header off, and you get a header in the package that you can solder on if you need it. The original one had no Wi-Fi, no Bluetooth. You had to do some fancy footwork to get it configured if you didn't have a monitor by connecting to it through the GPIO with a serial terminal. But it all worked. The only weird thing they did with the Zero, which I still don't understand why they haven't changed, is the video connector. It's a mini HDMI, which is a weird connector that sits in between the micro and the full size. Not very common, but you can buy adapters for it because these are so popular. I know you guys lost Fry's. That was kind of sad, but we have a chain out here in the East called Micro Center, which is kind of like just that part of Fry's. Everything except the appliances, the hardware, and the restaurant. So stores like that are good for going into if there's a place that replaced that out there for getting these adapters and everything. Zero W added Wi-Fi to the Zero, and 1 gigahertz single core processor, still very simple. They've kept the W simple to keep the power consumption down. That's one of the main things. This is something that you can set up with a solar pack, lithium-ion battery, and a camera in your backyard. It doesn't require a ton of power. And one of the things that we see these show up in the most these days, as so many hams have a Raspberry Pi Zero in their home, is the digital hotspots for digital radios. And these have been $5 all along, even the W model here. This was the latest revision to the W, the Pi Zero 2W. They're up to a 64-bit quad core 1 gig processor now, but nothing else has really changed except the Wi-Fi and Bluetooth are now in a new shielded CAN. So there's a little less RFI issues both in and out. If you're using something like this to run an RF project, they had a tendency of being affected by the project. So if it was something that was transmitting with any kind of power, sometimes the Pi would reboot because it wasn't shielded particularly well. And opposite of that too, putting out some RFI in certain RF projects, which isn't desirable, but still pretty basic. I always think, you know, I have one of these, and when I do a demonstration live, one of the things I love to do is to take one of these and hook it up to a 60-inch TV with a keyboard, a wireless keyboard and a mouse, and show them that even at the size of this thing, it is still a computer. It'll still boot to a full desktop and you can still launch a browser and browse with it. It's a little slow, but it still does everything a computer does. This is the Pi 400. This came out right after the Pi 4 did. Basically, they took a keyboard housing and straightened out the Pi 4 board, made it more linear, and put it inside here. It has pretty much the same hardware as the 4, 2 USB 2 ports, 2 USB 3 ports, only 4 gigs of RAM, but I would expect they're probably at some point going to come out with an 8 gig model with new 64-bit versions of Raspberry Pi OS. Has the 2 HDMI mini ports. Everything else is the same, except they finally nixed the 3.5 millimeter composite port. So it's gone from here. So if you want analog audio out of these, you have to use a USB sound card dongle, and no more composite video. Also, less cooling problems with the 400 than the 4 had. The 4s frequently require a heatsink and a tiny fan if you're running anything of any significance. The 400 has really good passive cooling. Is something different. This is the Raspberry Pi Pico. This came out really to compete with some of the smaller Arduino boards. This is a microcontroller using related hardware to the Raspberry Pi. They're very inexpensive. They'll run all sorts of code. I have a project here around one that I haven't done yet, but it's for a wall-mounted weather and clock display running on an e-paper display. I intend to get that together at some point, but these are neat, and there's lots of projects you can do on them. Lots of ham radio projects starting to come up built around the Pico. I usually don't talk much about the compute module. Just to be quick, this is the meat of a Raspberry Pi 4, the nitty gritty, the part of the 4 that makes it think. Put onto a separate module that has, you know, like an it's there if you're designing a project that requires a brain, basically, and you're designing something like this into an embedded piece of equipment. And then for prototyping and experiments, you can buy, a number of companies make them, and Pi makes an official one, a carrier for the compute module that basically turns it back into a full Raspberry Pi. So that's for your development and testing and prototyping. So just take a look at these real quick. I mean, this is pretty easy. I've covered most of this. The Raspberry Pi 3 layout, this was the form factor that existed through most of the history of this. That's where the micro SD slot is. There's a display port here, which is for using the Pi with certain touch screens and embedded displays. This is the camera port, and there's a basic camera, and there's a new high quality deluxe camera. Those are the official Pi cameras. There's also so many companies that make additional peripherals for this thing. The 4, which we covered, the changes, just less components on the board, better layout. So once you get this thing, you have to put an operating system on it. The most common operating system that goes on the Pi is Raspberry Pi OS. Used to be called Raspbian. A new version of this just came out a matter of days ago. It's kept up to date, it's maintained, it's supported through a huge open source community. It's based on Debian Linux, compatible going back to all Raspberry Pi models. It's pretty easy to get onto the Pi. And if you're familiar with Linux at all, it's very easy to use. If you're not familiar with Linux and you're a Windows person or even a Mac person, it's not going to be that hard to make that stretch. You're still going to find a start button and an expanding menu and a lot of similar things to other operating systems. The latest change they've made in the version that came out this week was no more default Pi account. There is no longer an account called Pi with the password of Raspbian or Raspberry, because a number of countries now are starting to pass laws forcing computer companies to not use common default passwords anymore, because it causes too much trouble when you get a large company or a government agency that buys a computer and a router and all this equipment and doesn't change any of their default passwords. And it happens. So it just closes a door that people get hacked into often. So no more default accounts on Raspberry Pi OS. What else is here? LibreElec. This is based on something called Kodi. Kodi is a set-top box system. It's a way of kind of making your own Roku. Kodi evolved out of a project called the XBMS. I can't remember the original name now, but it stood for Xbox, I think, multimedia system or something to that effect. And it was a version of Linux that somebody came up with to run on the original Xbox One to turn it into a set-top box. It evolved into what we have here. You can take a Pi and make your own open source set-top box like a Roku. Really cool. The Ubuntu desktop, Ubuntu server, Ubuntu core, different versions of Ubuntu. I haven't tried the latest versions of Ubuntu desktop for Pi. I was very disenchanted with the early versions. They were very buggy, and with Raspbian being as good as it is and as supported as it is, there's really no reason to use something like Ubuntu on this. RetroPie for making an old retro gaming machine. They even make these cool little cabinets that you can make like a little console, or you can build a larger one, 3D print one that looks like a little, stand-up console from the 80s. And this thin client OS is always on here. For those of you IT people, you know what thin clients are, but they're basically the modern equivalent of a green screen terminal for getting into larger systems without having a full-blown computer. So limitations. The Pi's ARM architecture, only programs that are compiled to run in that environment will work. And not everything compiles well for ARM, but more and more and more does every release. One of the things that does not run in ARM is a compatibility layer in Linux called Wine. And if you've ever heard of products called Play on Linux or Play on Mac or Crossover Mac and Crossover Linux, those are products that grew out of the Wine project. Wine is one of those recursive abbreviations that Linux nerds love, and it stands for Wine is not an emulator. So what that means is that Wine translates API calls. Hold on, didn't mean to go forward. Wine translates API calls instead of emulating a Windows machine. It takes all the various things that the program is looking for in Windows and converts them to something that it can find in Linux instead. So it doesn't work in ARM processors. There have been attempts to make it work under something like QEMU or Box, but it's just horribly slow and extremely buggy. A number of years back, we saw something in that list of operating systems called Windows IoT for the Pi. Microsoft, back when Windows 8 came out, was called the Surface, not the Surface Pro, but the original Surface was on an ARM processor. When they discontinued that computer, they kind of revamped that original Windows 8 ARM code and came up with the Raspberry Pi IoT. It wasn't the full version of Windows. It was just a back-end product with a web interface for creating Internet of Things programs. Now, today, Microsoft has jumped back into the ARM pool, and they're creating ARM versions of their tablets again. So people have managed to get the ARM version of Windows to run on the Raspberry Pi again. It's not official, probably breaks a bunch of rules, but you can do it. And that's Windows 10 and Windows 11. And because the Pi is now 64-bit, 8 gigs, and much faster, it actually works. A lot of people ask about Android. Broadcom makes the SoC chip that's in the Pi, and they've never opened up their SoC to Android. So there are people that have managed to hack Android on there and make it work, but it doesn't work well. Get asked a lot, why don't you use, and this is my invention here, the Cranberry Deluxe Mini. And, there are so many Pi alternatives out there under a whole bunch of different names. And people say, well, it's faster, it has this, it has that. The reason why we use Pis is because of the support. No matter what comes out, the Pi still has 90% of this market. And everything else is just small potatoes. But there are some interesting boards out there, and they're worth looking at and worth playing with, as long as you don't want to invest a whole bunch of money in them. The Beagle boards show up a lot in the Kiwi SDR project in our hobby. That's what runs those wonderful web SDR servers. And there was one, I'm not sure if it's still available, but there was a board the size of the Pi called the Latte Panda, which ran real Intel Windows. But the way that Windows is moving into the ARM department now, we really don't necessarily need that anymore. But there's lots of these, but some of them come and go. So you'll invest in something and then lose support for it. What can you do with it? Since we said it's a computer, it'll do anything a computer can do. It may not be as fast as your modern desktops, but the Model 4 is pretty good. And you have that addition of the GPIO bus to communicate with the outside world, sensing things going on around you, controlling things. So you can make a small desktop computer out of one, maybe a media center, music player, weather station, robotics, web-enabled controllers, for all sorts of things. I have a friend who is using one for his homebrew controller, so he can log into it and see what's going on with his brew equipment. Education, remote cameras. One of the guys in my club has like 20 of these around his property. Really cool. Terminal, thin client, gaming, kiosks, very small servers, whether web server, file server, database server, and why we're here, ham radio. So we're limited to Linux programs that run on ARM processors, but more and more software is getting ported over to the Pi. Originally, it was FLDigi and some rig control apps, SDR applications, but this has really grown. And this was a list originally, ADSB airplane tracking. This is really cool, something you can do with an RTL SDR dongle. Remote SDR server. The earlier versions of the Pi, you can put a Pi and an RTL SDR dongle where you need a receiver and then stream it back to a computer over the internet where you do the actual processing. But now with the Pi 3 and definitely with the Pi 4, you can have a full-fledged SDR radio running completely on the Pi. Digital radio hotspots, I mentioned that, for DMR, D-Star, System Fusion, Echolink nodes. The Echolink code can be ported over to Pis and takes up a lot less room than the desktop computers we've been running Echolink on. APRS, Whisper, antenna and rotator controls, a TNC, spectrum monitor, That's what this is here in the picture. PSK31 terminal and other modes. Rig control. RigPi is actually a commercial product sold by MFJ based on an open source idea and an open source piece of hardware. But you're buying a supported commercial product when you buy RigPi. You can get the code, you can buy a Pi, and you can try to create it on your own. But I think it's $300 and some odd for a complete RigPi outfit. And a transmitter. Let's look at what that means. So very early on, some people discovered that they could modulate a couple of the digital GPIO pins at a high enough frequency to transmit an RF signal. It's not a very clean signal, but it's RF. And the original project that was based on this was called Pi FM. It was a Linux distribution that you burned onto one of these micro SD cards, and your Pi would boot into it. It didn't have a graphical user interface. It was just all command line. What you did was, after you set up the micro SD card, you would fill the root directory of that little SD card with music files, MP3s, AC3s, and a playlist file. And there's a config file where you could set certain parameters for random play or whatever you wanted, and a frequency for it to broadcast on. And this thing would transmit your music in FM stereo over the frequency that you choose. You need a very short antenna because it actually puts out more power than is allowed by law by these little micro FM transmitters. I was curious what it would actually do when I put mine together, hooked it up to my outside 2 meter 440 antenna, obviously not tuned correctly for this, but I got about 1.5 miles from my house and I was still receiving it. So I turned around and went back and unplugged it. Neat though. Once again, the output's not very clean, but it worked. And they even managed to get it to come out in stereo, which was pretty interesting. So I think you can still download this and still get it to run. So they took it further than this though. They figured out how to get it to modulate in other modes, AM, sideband, digital modes, and that brought us this thing. Tapper, the Tucson Amateur Packet Radio Club, created this Raspberry Pi hat called Whispering Raspberries or Whisper Pi. It's been called under a couple of different names. This is the 20-meter version. I have one of these. You put this on a Pi, you run a command line program, put your parameters into it, and this becomes a whisper transmitter. It does have the proper filtering on the board to clean up the signal. And you can play with this. You can, there's a jumper you can cut, there's a trace. I forget if you cut the jumper or you actually bridge a jumper on it. It's been a while since I've looked at it, but it allows you to use it for other modes. That in combination with an RTL SDR receiver on the same Pi could actually create a complete transceiver. It would be a little clunky to use, but it would work. QRPguys.com was selling the same kit, but in a through-hole build design. They did still have boards available for $10, but they had stopped selling the kit. This is just another Pi project. This was put together by Ian Lee, KD8CEC, known for his extensive work on the micro-BitX transceiver, aftermarket stuff. Ian kind of redeveloped some of the applications to fit on a Pi and has basically the Pi running the micro-BitX, using it as a digital terminal here. The WebSDR project and OpenWebRX, which is what the Kiwi SDR projects are based on. OpenWebRX is the open source version of Kiwi SDR where it started. Both of these will work on Pis. The Kiwi, no, the Kiwi is only designed for the Kiwi SDR and the BeagleBone. These two will run on a Pi. Here's TNC Pi. It's a modified version of TNCX for Raspberry Pi. There's a digital hotspot. This is my original one. I think this was a kit. It was under $50 for all the parts except for the Pi. And you just solder it together, load the Pi Star software onto it, and plug in all your own numbers, do the configuring. Really handy if you don't live near a DMR, Fusion, or D-Star repeater, or P25 and a couple other formats now. So the Pi 4 can be used to put together a complete digital terminal because they are fast enough now. FT8 is funny. A lot of people don't realize that WSJTX does require a decent amount of computing power to actually do what it does, because it's decoding a large passband of signals simultaneously. The Pi 4 can do it, and there's some modified versions of WSJTX out there, but if you get a large enough touchscreen for your portable Pi terminal, you can do it. It's doable. If you want to run FLDigi on it, you can hide the FLDigi menu and do a couple other things. Same thing with WSJTX. This is the ham clock. It was a project originally, it showed up in QST magazine. It was originally designed for microcontroller project, but it was rewritten to run on the Pi. This is a really easy way to make a ham clock. Just get a Pi, get the official Raspberry Pi 7-inch display, and get the enclosure that I recommend, and then just put this software on it. And when I break from the full screen display here, you'll see that there's one of these sitting over my shoulder, and I'll get the ham clock running on it. I already talked about this, the Rig Pi. Here's an image of it. And it's neat. The software runs in a web browser, allows you to control your rig from a tablet, a phone, a laptop, and then there's an audio link you can add to it so you can actually operate. There's always new projects coming out for the Pi. Last time I updated this presentation, this was the Caribou Light Raspberry Pi Hat. This was a 30 megahertz through 6 gigahertz dual channel SDR, and it was a crowdsourced project on crowdsupply.com. Not sure if it's still active or not. Books out there. This is one of them. You can just search in Amazon for this. Hamshack Raspberry Pi. Bunch of projects for the Pi. This is a ham radio specific Pi distribution called Ham Pi. There's a Ham Pi Groups.io group where you can learn what's in there, any bugs, any issues you have, you can post in there. The creator does follow the group, and he puts all the new releases. We're up to version 2, I think, at this point, and he keeps refining it. I know you can't read anything in here in this list, neither can I. It's just to point out how many ham applications are in the ham radio menu when you bring it up in the start menu here. I found another one when I was poking around. PU2SPY came up with one called Pi SDR. It's similar to Ham Pi, but more SDR oriented. And this is good if you're using some of the SDR libraries to build some sort of custom SDR project for yourself. And there's a list of everything that came out on this one. One of the lists which I found interesting is he managed to get SDR Angel running on the Pi. That's pretty cool. If you don't know what SDR Angel is, if you think about Ham Radio Deluxe, which is a Windows program, Ham Radio Deluxe contains like every possible program you would need for rig control and logging and digital modes and everything else you need ham radio application wise all rolled into one. SDR Angel is a whole bunch of SDR software all rolled into one application, including, I know in its full blown version, I don't know if the Pi version will do it, the ability to decode digital signals like DMR and D-Star. So really neat. Is the last slide. This presentation is posted on my blog, but I'll email a copy to Matthew as well. There's a link to it through Google Drive, I believe. Like I said, the webpage, neilgoldstein.com, just click on FOFIO and you can email me. Either of the emails that I've put in the presentation work, but neil@neilgoldstein.com is easy to remember, or my call sign W2NDG at ARRL. So that's the end of the presentation. Show one thing real quick. This is VNC remote software, and I am going to remote into this Pi console that's right over my shoulder here. Let me blow this up a little. So this is a Pi 4, and I mean, you can see, it's pretty snappy. There's really not much delay in hitting here. Chromium. I'll show you FL-Digi. This is the size of the screen using. This will give me an error because there's nothing connected to it, but you can see it's definitely usable on this screen. So you can do stuff like this. WSJTX, which will definitely complain. Rig. But you can see I have the menu turned off here. Turn it back on. It won't let me because there's an error message, but with the menu off and the fonts shrunken down a bit, it's definitely usable. So, all right. Let me put this away for now. And go back to the regular screen. So, any questions anybody has, and then if you have any time, I have a little show and tell.
That was a great presentation. Yeah, I'm glad you can make it out. I have one quick question. Do you have any experience with Docker on Pi's, or?
No, I don't. I started dabbling in it a number of years ago at work, but I work for such a large organization that there's only so many hats I can wear. So I haven't had to use Docker really. Another team that we are associated with is called the High Performance Computing Team. I work very closely with a group that does all the cluster computing at Sloan Kettering with Linux clusters and Amazon AWS and all sorts of setups like that. So they're a lot more familiar with it than I am. Someday, it's on my list.
Yeah, same here. That's why I was wondering.
All right. Anybody else have any questions or?
Yeah, I have one, if I may.
Sure.
You're talking about you can do remote control. You know, I'm not the most tech savvy person at all. I have a couple of the Pi 4s, an 8 gig and a 4 gig. Want to know if I can do remote control on an FTDX 101D.
You can, and I mean, so there's a lot of levels to that question. You can take a Pi and interface it with your Yaesu. That's the new 101.
Yeah, that's the new one.
Yeah. So I mean, you can.
One.
you can use something like, this is the thing I was talking about. This is a self-contained 7-inch touchscreen Pi up here. See if I can get it down without creating an avalanche. This is just a Raspberry Pi 4, and it's in a custom case with a fan and a bit of a power splitter so you can run the cooling. But if you look at the side here, I mean, that's just the side of a Pi 4 sticking out here. The screen is the official Raspberry Pi touchscreen. It's just in a really fancy case, which wasn't very expensive. The screen costs a lot more than either the Pi or the case. But I can control my IC 7300 with this. I can control any modern rig that has cat control with that Pi. Now, then I can remote into that from another location, operate that remote control. I could run audio software like Skype. This is how we used to do it before there were applications actually that did the whole thing, like RigPi from MFJ. We would run something like Skype to get the audio to go, with little tricks to get the push to talk to work. Depending on the level of complexity, there are plenty of ways to do this. The easiest and cheapest way to get remote control on your rig is a website called Remote Hams. And they have a product that they produce. It's a free product called RCF Orb. You run the server on a Windows machine, and you run a client either on a Windows laptop or an Android phone or tablet. And you can do full rig control from that thing and the audio portion. I've checked into nets from the commuter train on that thing. I don't recommend doing stuff like that all the time. You're better off stationary, because when the thing releases, you don't know if you're still transmitting. Always a good idea, if you're going to get into remote control, by the way, to look through the menus in your rig and set default timeouts. So you don't leave your rig transmitting for half an hour because you lost your connection. So, but yes, you can remote that radio with your Pi. The MFJ product, RigPi, for $300 and some odd is like a turnkey setup out of the box that'll work. But there's ways to do it if you like to DIY stuff, just a lot more complex. I hope that answered your question.
Yeah, very much. I appreciate it. Yeah, I'm definitely not I've tried to learn from, I don't know if you've heard of him, Jason, KM4ACK. I've tried to learn some of his stuff, but it's just, I'm not computer savvy at all. It's amazing I even made it on Zoom.
Yeah. I got into this field because I taught my parents how to use a Macintosh. I was in professional dental products sales. I wasn't always an IT guy. And that's what made me realize that I had the ability to teach. You have to find the right teacher, and not always works. Once you see something work in your own hands, it makes a lot more sense.
I greatly appreciate the info.
You're welcome. Let me look at the chat and see. Okay. Sometimes there's questions that show up in there.
All right. I don't know if anyone in what is it? The room over there has any questions? Questions, anyone? All right.
All right. Let me. I know you probably want to get out of here. It's actually 10:30 at night here, but.
Well, you want to get out, yeah. Don't want to keep you up too late.
I'm okay. I run a net tomorrow morning for my club, but it's all right. I run 2 nets. That one's just a quick check-in net.
So I have a quick question about the Arduinos. So what is you said it was application specific, but what do you use an Arduino for?
Well, in ham radio, a lot of the radios that we build, if you've heard of Hans Summers and, for example, QRP, there's so many QRP companies, QRP guys, QRP kits, and Hans is QRP Labs is Hans Summers. He has right now one of the most popular CW QRP rigs that's ever been made in our hobby, the QCX. It comes, it's come in different sizes, different formats. And you're talking about, I built this one. This is a monoband CW radio that's the size of a pack of cards and puts out 5 watts. It has an incredible number of features on it. It's a CW rig. It's a whisper rig. It'll do a couple other digital modes. It has test equipment built in. It has a CW decoder built in. It's pretty amazing. And it all runs on what's called an Atmega 328, which is the processor on this Arduino Uno. Most of the small ham radio projects that we use run on microcontrollers. But what we really don't realize is that up until something like the ICOM 7300 or some of these other sophisticated radios, that the rigs in our hobby, going back to something like a Kenwood TS430, are using microcontrollers. That's how they work. And things all over your house use things like this to work. A modern toaster, your refrigerator panel. Some of them are using more sophisticated embedded computers like a Pi, but no, most of them are using something like this. Do you have a Ring doorbell? Do you have a Blink camera?
Yeah.
Do you have, stuff like that? They're all using something like this. It's a basic computer that doesn't have to support a video display. It doesn't have to support a keyboard and a mouse. You load a program onto it directly into its memory, and it executes that program. And that program can do almost anything. The microbit from BBC, which I mentioned in the talk, comes with a program loaded on it. This is out of the box what it does. That's saying hello. I have it upside down, I think, but
Yeah, it's okay. I get the idea. Yeah, I saw the letters.
now it's telling me to push this button. Now it's telling me to push this button. At one point in this whole process, it plays a game where you tilt it and move a ball around. It tells you to clap, and it counts the number of times you clap because it has a microphone. It's pretty cool. And this is a regular microcontroller like this Uno here, doesn't have all that stuff, but these buses here, these connectors, can be hooked up to sensors and used to create something like a weather station, a thermometer, a tilt sensor like that one, things like that. I have one of the projects on the drawing board here is to create a thermometer for my wood stove. Up on the mantle above the wood stove, telling me the stove surface temperature, the flue temperature, and the room ambient temperature. Gonna be fun. So, but there's so many microcontrollers. This is another one I put here. And this one kind of really gets into a gray area between something like a microcontroller and a Pi, because it has a display on it. And it has embedded Wi-Fi and Bluetooth. This is called an ESP32, but it has a display. I'm teaching my makers group about this subject that you're asking about, the fact that microcontrollers run most of the things that we do as hams. So as a basic project, I am building a microcontroller controlled FM radio, which is very simple code to make that work. But it's a great learning tool and it's an example to show them, what can be done. The only other thing I have sitting here is DMR hotspot or
right.
digital radio hotspot. This is a duplex one, larger board than what most people are used to seeing. And it's running on a Pi 4, which I have the lid off of because these things get hot. So, but it works. So there's always so much going on, but yeah, that and the last piece, because this arrived today. Does anybody know what this thing is? Anybody heard about these things? This is the True SDX QRP radio. It evolved from this. A couple of brilliant engineers using the same basic design managed to shoehorn enough SDR code onto that Atmega processor to create a software-defined based sideband and CW transceiver. So this thing, it's the size of a cigarette pack, is a 5-band, 5-watt radio. It's pretty incredible. And yeah, I made a contact with Southern New Jersey on 80 meters this evening on this thing as a test. And you talk right into it. The microphone is right here and the push to talk is here.
Nice.
What's the name of that again?
I'll hold it right up to the screen. It's called the True. You see the T and the R are in parentheses. SDX. The reason for that is that the original project, the USDX, went open source and got copied by the Chinese. So these, if you're seeing these cheap QRP rigs all over eBay and AliExpress right now, that's what those are. They're from the original version of this project, which was not finished. And most of them are pretty awful. This radio came from China, from an AliExpress retailer, but the way Manuel and his partner here, PE1NNZ, the way they've done the licensing on this is that you're not allowed to sell these unless you send one to them and they approve it first. So that's where these come from. $137 shipped to my door. 5-watt. Oh, and just they thought of everything. If you feed it with a USB power source over the data connection here, you give it 5 volts, it'll still work. It'll only put out 0.5 watt, but it'll actually still function and still transmit if you like playing with extreme QRP. So, but once again, things like this can't happen without things like this. And there is a rig coming out sometime in the next year that you'll hear about that has a Raspberry Pi inside of it. That's going to be a very interesting project. We're talking about a 50-watt multi-band SDR-based transceiver that's going to probably run less than $300. You'll have to put it together like Lego, like this guy's other stuff, but not much soldering. Yeah,
All right.
we're living in fascinating times.
Yeah, that's cool stuff. I know. Always been interested in QRP. The issue is a lot of it's CW, which I know you mentioned. Yeah, the fact that there is AM QRP seems fantastic. That's perfect. If no other comments or questions, I know Kevin has something we need to move on to. We have club business to attend. I don't know if he wants to record that and I'll record that.
I mean, you could always, I know with us, we stop and then restart to get separate recordings.
Great presentation. Thank you.
You're welcome. Matthew, I'm going to email you a link. It's actually, it's the post I did when I did the presentation for Ham Radio University, but it is all of the same links.
Okay.
And the link to the presentation is on there as well. So I'm going to send that to you. All right. For some reason, your video doesn't come together, ask me, and I'll give you links to one of the other ones. There's another version of this out there that I did. So.
All right, perfect. Yeah, great presentation. I think everyone enjoyed it, and we'd love to have you back if you ever want to talk about digital modes or more like that. I'm sure.
Yeah,
a whole bunch of stuff you got that's interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, there's new stuff coming. yeah, we're going to be doing. I definitely have some stuff in the hopper that I'm working on. So we're a very active group up here. COVID, we grew 3 times our original size during the pandemic, partly because of that repeater at 2,800 feet. So
That's always good stuff. Repeater is nice to have.
all right. Well, thank you. I'm going to get ready for bed.
All right. Yeah. Take care. It was great having you guys. Thanks for coming.
Thank you.
All right. Good night.
Good night.
All right. Without further ado, Kevin, if you want to share the screen, we can get the party started, as they say.
I'll get the party started, all right. So before we do that, just a couple announcements and stuff. Stuff coming up tomorrow night. So I'm going to talk about elections that are going to be later this quarter. But first off, we got a couple events coming up. Okay, we don't need that. That's fine. Don't worry about that. Thank you, Andrew. Tomorrow night, usual at 1800 Friday night, we have HF Fridays going out in the shack. Boom, HF, boom, propagation. That's a terrible marker. And then on Saturday, in the afternoon at 1300, we have a little tea hunt that we're doing. Boom, Yagi, that's a terrible marker. Oh, I forgot to. We were gonna do it earlier in the quarter. But a bunch of stuff had to get moved around because of the FCCs as well as open house. But join us on Saturday. Saturday for that. Come hang out. We can have some fun. Do some tea hunting. I'm gonna jog in this because it's very important that you get these visuals. Boom, Yagi. The FCCP is going to effect on money. Boom, look at that. On Tuesday. If you want to get, if you want to get a license, now's the perfect time, right? It's a little bit late, but if you still know anybody who wants to get licensed, let me know immediately. It's a pretty, we don't have a lot of time because any session submitted over this weekend. If you lessons down on Monday, that's a pretty big risk. But just be prepared for that. Let me know if you have any questions. And then next Saturday, so this Saturday we have a tea on it, but the Saturday after that, we'll be helping out with the Society of Women Engineers building an engineer day. So they'll have a bunch of middle school students. This will be the first one. And it's at 1300, 1 p.m. And we'll be meeting at the shack in the courtyard. Yeah, anybody is welcome. Come on by, bring your friends, and come find some transmitters. Saturday after next, we're helping out with building an engineer day. A bunch of middle school students are gonna come, and a bunch of different clubs are gonna be leading them through activities. I can use some help generating ideas. Maybe we can do a small tea hunt in the courtyard or around that area. This will be the first in-person one. The first in-person one that we've done. So it's gonna be pretty exciting. The first in-person that we've done in a while, at least. But yeah, if you want to come help make dreams come true for some middle school students and showing them cool amateur radio stuff, come help on Saturday. If you're not available next Saturday, I can use some help getting set up in the shack and stuff, or with whatever activity we are doing. Yeah, any questions? Okay, cool. So we also wanted to bring your brain attention to the fact that we have officer meetings coming up soon. later in the quarter, probably, it will be the second to last general meeting. We'll have elections on. So we just want to bring everybody's attention to the future of CPARC. So in a couple weeks, when we in a couple weeks, we'll send out the self-nomination form. If anybody is interested, you just kind of sign up and we'll go over the requirements and stuff all about that here now. So any member is welcome to nominate themselves to become an officer to continue the legacy, the long felt tradition of the CPARC establishment. A couple little requirements: you have to have at least 2.0 Cal Poly cumulative GPA. You got to be active, and you got to be a current Cal Poly student in order to sign up to become an officer. So this is the these are the positions from last year. We're gonna have a meeting at our next officer meeting. We're gonna meet and go over the positions, make sure that they still kind of meet our needs, and see if we need to make any changes. So if you see something slightly different, that's possible. That will be possible. But let's just go through it real quick. If any of the current officers have any input on rules and stuff, let me know. Feel free to blurt out. These are what we call our elected positions. These are basically the positions that ASI officially recognizes. So we have these positions, and then our other what we call appointed positions, although they're usually also voted on. But these are the positions that ASI recognizes, and ASI requires the president, treasurer, and the secretary. President, of course, is in charge of the whole shebangle and looking at the big picture long term, making sure everybody stays on track. Vice president, fill in if they get assassinated or something. Treasurer with the money stuff. Andrea is our current treasurer. He is a business or accounting major. This is something like that. Okay, awesome. So he'll be working with the treasurer for next year to go over everything to have to do with our budget. Yes, Jack.
I think it's important to add that you don't necessarily need to be a business major.
Yeah.
For the treasurer position, so don't let that scare you.
And don't let experience scare you at all. I mean, they let me and Jack become president, as well as Matthew and Helen and Davide. So yeah, I became well, I'll get into that in a bit. But yeah, treasurer, if you want to help out with the money stuff as well as donations. Secretary, keeping track of emails, calendar, meeting minutes, keeping track of action items at our officer meetings especially, and making sure everything is up to date. Right, and then here's what we call again our appointed positions. These are the positions that ASI doesn't officially recognize, but we still kind of need in our club that we find really helpful to achieve our dreams. Starting off with diversity officer, coordinating diversity, but making people feel welcome in CPARC as well as in the amateur community. Good point of contact, being that point of contact for people within CPARC as well as for other organizations. Event coordinator, doing all the events and stuff, T-hunts, SWE, triathlons, bike rides, bike races, that sort of stuff. As well as a while ago, we used to have radio event coordinator, social event coordinator, and test session coordinator. And we lumped them all into one lovely position. So that'll be some of those responsibilities in their projects. Projects are good. Keeping track of projects, making sure project leads are doing the projects and doing the budgets for the projects and making sure projects happen. Station manager in charge of the shack, and I believe the repeater as well. Got repeater, making sure it works, that there's no golf carts taken off of them and stuff like that. Emergency response lead, we combined this with a net coordinator a while ago. Being in charge of training, emergency preparedness. We have an emergency response, but we have an emergency manual on the shack, as well as a lot of equipment that needs to be maintained, especially since we're also ECC 16. System administrator, computer systems, websites, updating websites, hardware, software, webmaster, w6bnz.org, maintaining that. Public relations outreach, the weekly newsletter for the EE department, as well as the engineering student council representative going to those meetings. And then on to the last but most important position in all of the club, EBAF bar manager, who is in charge of food and drinks in the fridge of the shack, as well as for meetings and anything else that requires consumable items. Jack, as outgoing EBAF, do you have anything you would like to say about the duties of your position?
I think it's self-evident that pizza is good.
Good
People
pizza's good.
people definitely appreciate food, and I think that is it's good position to be in. That is the most important officer. It's the most important. It's the most important. Maybe not the most visible, but the most not just. But EBAF is pretty cool, and yeah, you would just coordinate buying the food for meetings and events, and there's a budget for that.
Next time EBAF is highly encouraged to get a kegerator in the shack and a keg full of cactus cooler.
Yeah, you can do any kind of food because the events are not open to the public, so we're not subject to the same food restrictions as
Some of them are. Yeah, so yeah, I know I just rambled. I just realized that I know I rambled on a bunch here, but anybody is welcome to become an officer and pursue the future CPARC, or pursue it, or lead it. I guess lead it. That's a better term. I became an officer in 2019-ish. I delivered a piece of paper to Jack and Davide that I needed a signature on for a farewell gift. They said you should become an officer, and then I became that coordinator. I didn't know what I was doing, but I figured it out. And like, for example, in order to be treasurer, you don't have to know everything about money and how it grows and how it works and how it inflates. I heard something about that, like a balloon. I think that's how money works. But you will put a lot of energy into making sure you are prepared as much as it can be. And a lot of it is learning as you go. It's all, you just gotta start out and have that passion and want to make stuff happen, make dreams come true. That's a good cliche. Cool. Any questions, comments, concerns? Beautiful. Don't forget about T-Hunt, HR Fridays, Building and Engineer Day, and nets and officer meetings. Oh, we have officer meetings every Wednesday at 5:30, 17:30 on Zoom and in the shack. Anybody is welcome to come. They're open to the public, just like most of our other meetings and events. So if you wanna, even if you don't want to become an officer, even if you just wanna check out what we're doing, what decisions we're making, what the future of what we're working on, what the future of the club looks like. Anybody is welcome to join us. And we usually say something on Discord when to remind people when that's going to happen. Cool. You got anything else, Matthew? Cool. I think we can stop the recording there. Let us know if you have any questions. Call polywinterclub@gmail.com or Discord, or you can find all that stuff on our website, w6bnz.org. Reach out to us, live your best life, and have fun. Thanks for watching.
Great meeting.
Oh, we're recording for this device. Okay, now thanks for watching.